The smell of baking bread filled the stone kitchen, while Martha chuckled softly as she watched the children play on the packed earth floor. Thomas, seated on the porch, was sharpening the blade of his hoe under the golden light of the setting sun. He looked up and smiled, seeing Caleb trying to teach his little sister how to toss stones into the creek. "A bit farther, little one," he advised, his voice calm and thick with affection. The wind carried with it a strange scent, like wet earth and old iron. Thomas furrowed his brow, gazing beyond the golden fields. A shape moved on the horizon, blurry, like a mirage. Martha wiped her hands on her apron and stepped closer. "Is it just travelers?" she asked, her voice slightly trembling. Thomas did not answer right away. Deep in his chest, a heavy feeling sank like a stone in the river. "Let's get inside," he said at last, his hand settling firmly on her shoulder. The deep, urgent tone made Martha pale. Gathering the children quickly into her arms, she rushed into the house. Thomas lingered a moment longer on the porch, his eyes locked on the rising dust along the road. His fingers reached instinctively for the rifle hanging by the door, while his feet, planted firmly on the floorboards, refused to retreat. When the first line of redcoats appeared, Thomas felt his mouth go dry. There were many, more than he could count. British soldiers marched with the cold precision of machines, their bayonets catching the last light of the sun. Inside the house, he could hear Martha trying to calm the children. "Hush now, my angels. Papa is here," she whispered, her fragile voice straining to hide her fear. The sharp knock at the door made the windows shudder. "In the name of the king, open up!" barked a commanding voice. Thomas turned to Martha. For a single moment, just one, their eyes met, and there, without a word, they sealed a silent pact of eternal protection. "Stay behind me," he said, not breaking his gaze from hers. The rifle shook in his hands. His heart did too. But his soul was already prepared to fight. With the second blow, the door splintered open. Boots stormed into their home like a tempest across the open fields. Thomas raised the rifle, his breath caught in his chest, knowing that from that moment on, every choice would come at the cost of blood. And there, when the cold eyes of the soldiers met his own, Thomas understood. The war had not begun in the cities. It had begun here, in the heart of his own home. The door burst open with a thunderous crack. Shards of wood flew through the air, striking Martha on the shoulder and drawing a cry from her lips. Thomas raised his rifle in a desperate instinct, but a bayonet shoved the barrel down before he could fire. The soldiers swarmed in like a starving plague, their eyes barren of compassion. Martha clutched the children to her chest, while Thomas fought in vain against the tide. "Stay behind me!" Thomas shouted, trying to shield his family from the flood of red. One soldier, his mouth twisted into a cruel grin, seized Martha by the arm. With a roar, Thomas lunged forward, but two men tackled him down, pinning him brutally. "No! No!" he cried, his voice tearing at his throat. Martha struggled fiercely, with the desperate strength only a mother could summon, but it was like battling death itself. "Silence, peasant," growled the British officer, driving a fist into Thomas's gut. The world spun. Falling to his knees, Thomas watched as filthy boots trampled his home like so much underbrush. Soldiers ripped open cupboards, shattered dishes, and spilled sacks of corn onto the dirt floor. Martha, gripped by two men, still fought. "Please, no!" she pleaded, her thin, desperate voice echoing like a prayer in a desecrated temple. Thomas spat blood and hatred, straining against the men who held him. "Lay a hand on her and I swear I'll drag every one of you to hell with me," he bellowed, eyes burning with fury. The officer only laughed, a sound cold as iron scraping stone. "This already is your hell, colonist." The room descended into a grotesque circus of violence. The children sobbed, huddled in a corner, their faces smeared with tears and terror. Their home, their fortress, was crumbling around them. Martha was thrown to the floor, and though restrained, Thomas screamed her name until his voice broke. Caleb, the eldest, tried to run to his mother but was seized roughly by a soldier. "Leave him be," Thomas begged, tears mixing with sweat and blood on his face. No plea was heard, no mercy was shown. And as the sun died outside, something even more precious was dying within those walls. Bound like a beast, Thomas caught Martha's eyes, wide with a terror he had never before conceived. A final trembling, "I love you," escaped her lips, barely carried on breath. And then, when the vile act was finished, the cruel whisper of steel-cutting flesh broke the hollow silence. Thomas shut his eyes, not from cowardice, but to etch that agony into the marrow of his soul. He knew with a dreadful certainty the night that had fallen upon them would never give way to dawn. The fire started slow, a small dance of flames over the scattered straw. Lying on the floor, Thomas felt the heat lick at his boots before he saw the smoke thickening in the room. "Burn it all," ordered the British officer, his voice echoing like a sentence passed. The crackle of the flames blended with the muffled sobs of the children. Each snap of breaking wood sounded like bones shattering. A funeral without bells. The soldier holding Thomas finally let him go, shoving him against the wall with contempt. "Let him die with whatever's left," he muttered. Thomas gasped for breath, struggling to rise. His eyes scoured the wreckage. Martha, lying still on the ground. Caleb clutched his younger siblings, trying to be strong. The thick smoke stung his eyes, but Thomas knew he could not, would not, look away. Not ever again. He crawled to Martha, his knees scraping across the shattered glass and blood-smeared floor. "Martha! Martha, look at me!" he begged, his voice mangled by sorrow. Her eyes fluttered open, faint and fading, like a candle guttering at its end. Our boys," she whispered, the ghost of a broken smile on her lips. Thomas took her cold hand and pressed it against his chest, as if he could will her warmth back into being. "I'm here, my love. I'm here," he murmured, the smoke tearing at his throat. Around them, the house they had built brick by brick began to crumble. The beams of the roof cracked and sagged overhead, their life collapsing from the top down. But Thomas did not look at the fire, nor at the sky he could no longer see. He looked only at Martha, praying for a miracle that would never come. Martha squeezed Thomas's fingers one last time, a feeble pressure, so faint it might have been imagined. Then her eyes slipped into emptiness. An eternal silence fell between them, broken only by the groaning collapse of the walls. "No, no, please," Thomas whispered, pressing his forehead against hers. His children were crying out to him, calling his name, but the world, for him, had stopped turning. In that instant, everything died. With a primal howl that seemed to rise from the bowels of the earth, Thomas lifted Martha into his arms. The house was falling, the world was burning, but he stood, carving a path through the smoke with dry eyes and a soul ablaze. As the crackling inferno devoured the Whitaker home, Thomas made a silent vow. No king, no empire, no army would ever wash away the blood spilled that night. Night covered the valley like a cloak soaked in ash. Thomas walked with heavy steps, carrying Martha in his arms, while the children followed, sobbing. The heat of the embers lit their soot-streaked faces, streaked with tears. With every step, Thomas felt the ground tremble beneath his boots, as if the earth itself wept with them. Their home was now nothing more than memory and smoke, blown away by the cruel wind. They reached an old fig tree, where Martha had once loved to sit and sew on summer afternoons. Thomas knelt carefully, laying her body upon the damp grass. Caleb approached, his eyes wide and hollow. "Papa, is Mama going to get better?" he asked, his voice nearly a whisper. Thomas looked at his son and tried to smile, but found no strength to lie. He simply ran a hand through the boy's hair and pulled him close. The wind carried the stench of burned wood and scorched flesh. Kneeling, Thomas held Martha's hand, already growing cold with death. "You were always my foundation, Martha," he whispered, his voice breaking. "And I swear our children will live free." The words tumbled out like broken prayers, carried off by the wind, as though the universe itself needed to hear them. The children shivered with cold and fear. Thomas tore his own shirt to wrap around them, each gesture marked by a silent, aching pain. Caleb tried to be strong, just as he had seen his father be, but his small shoulders trembled. Thomas looked at his children. They were all that remained, all that still beat within him. "You will survive," he said in a low voice, another vow cast into the empty sky. The silence of the early morning was broken only by the rustle of trees and the distant collapse of burning wood. Thomas lifted his eyes to the full moon, a pale, cold face in the indifferent heavens. A frozen fury filled his chest. It was no longer the explosive rage of tragedy's first blow. It was something deeper, a slow, eternal fire, one that would only be extinguished by justice dealt at the edge of a blade. Standing beneath the fig tree, with Martha at his feet and his children huddled behind him, Thomas raised his clenched fist. The night breeze carried his hoarse voice into the darkness. "I swear before God and all men, they will pay." And in that oath, something greater than grief was born. It was the beginning of a revolt that would ignite not only fields, but hearts. The farmer had died. The soldier had awakened. Dawn found Thomas sitting beneath the fig tree, his eyes dry, his face hardened. Martha's dried blood still stained his hands, but he made no move to wash it away. "Let all see what they have done," he thought. The fires from the night before still sent smoke into the horizon. Thomas knew that this day would not be for mourning. It would be the day he began, in silence and in pain, to forge an answer to the violence that had destroyed him. Caleb woke first, shivering from the cold. He stumbled toward his father with uncertain steps. "What will we do now, Papa?" he asked, his voice broken by fear. Thomas looked at the boy and saw not the frightened child of yesterday, but the man who would have to survive in the new world rising from the ashes. "We will fight, my son," Thomas answered in a grave voice. "For your mother, for our home, for our freedom." Before they left, Thomas dug a shallow grave beneath the fig tree with his own hands. He laid Martha there, wrapped in the blanket she had sewn herself for the winter. No words could suffice for that farewell. Only the scrape of the spade against the wet earth and the whisper of the wind carried his vow. "You will live in every step I take," he swore, kneeling as his children huddled behind him. With a hunting rifle slung across his back and a shadowed gaze, Thomas took Caleb by the hand and gathered the children. They walked toward the dirt road, leaving behind the smoldering ruins of all they had loved. Each step Thomas took was heavy, but steady. He did not yet know where the rebellion would begin, but he knew who his first targets would be. The officers who had led the massacre. They had already signed their own death warrants. The nearest village, Millfield, lay half a day's journey ahead. There, it was said, a few men had already begun gathering in small bands of resistance, weary of the crown's humiliations and raids. Thomas walked with his eyes fixed on the horizon, feeling the invisible weight of Martha across his shoulders. He would no longer be a bystander to fate. It was time to write his own chapter in the story of freedom's fight. When the small village finally appeared, its chimneys sending up thin columns of cold morning smoke, Thomas tightened his grip on the rifle. His heart no longer beat out of fear, but out of purpose. In that forgotten town, among hardened farmers and deserter soldiers, he would find his brothers in arms, and there, beneath the shadow of oppression, the flame of resistance would be born. Millfield looked less like a village and more like a memory of what it once had been. Houses with broken boards, wary faces peeking through cracks. Thomas led his children down the dirt street, feeling heavy stares settle on him. At the center of the square, a faded British flag hung limp from the pole, a symbol of power, but also of decay. Here, he knew, something new was taking root. In the old warehouse, he found what he had been searching for: men with grimy faces, tattered clothes, and hardened eyes. They spoke in hushed tones, always keeping their backs to the door. One of them, a burly man with a scar across his cheek, rose to meet Thomas. "Lost something, stranger?" he growled. Thomas stepped forward, the rifle slung across his back, his children huddling behind him. "I haven't lost anything," he answered firmly. "I've come seeking justice." A heavy silence fell over the warehouse. The scarred man studied him, eyes narrowed. Then he let out a short, bitter laugh. "Justice? Around here, friend, the only justice comes by powder and courage." Others gathered closer, some nodding. Thomas held the man's gaze without flinching. "I have courage enough," he said, his voice cold as steel, "and a blood debt to settle." That was enough to part the crowd. While his children were taken in by an elderly woman offering shelter, Thomas sat among the insurgents. He listened to stories of burned farms, ruined families, and missing brothers. Each tale was a mirror of his own grief. "We are fed up," one of them said, slamming his fist on the table. "But without a leader, we're just dust on the wind." Thomas lowered his head, thoughtful. Perhaps this was his fate. Night fell over Millfield like a heavy shroud. In silence, Thomas was invited to share the fire and the hard bread. "Tomorrow we hunt Crown patrols," said the scarred man. "If you've got any courage left, you'll come." Thomas simply nodded. Deep inside, he knew. With each step, he moved further from the farmer he once had been. Here, beneath tattered flags and broken hearts, something greater than himself was being born. As the campfire crackled, Thomas studied the hardened faces around him. They were not trained soldiers. They were common men, forged in suffering like himself. And there, in the warmth of the flames and the cold of revolt, Thomas understood. The fight was no longer his alone. It was theirs. And when the next day's blood was spilled across the fields, a new name would be carved into memory. His. The dawn painted the sky in blood-red hues as Thomas tightened his calloused hands around the rifle's stock. In the chill mist, the insurgents gathered behind the stones lining the road. "British patrol in 15 minutes, whispered the scarred man, now introduced as Elias. Thomas nodded, feeling his heart beat not with fear, but with expectation. It was the call of war. The men melted into the landscape like shadows. Thomas took position behind an old walnut tree, his rifle resting against a twisted branch. The silence was so thick even breathing felt like a risk. Caleb, hidden back with the other children in the village, weighed heavy on his mind like an anchor. But Thomas knew. Every act here was for them, to ensure his children would never live under foreign boots. The sound of hooves shattered the mist. 6 British soldiers appeared, marching casually, rifles slung across their backs. The Crown's flag fluttered lazily in the breeze. Elias raised 3 fingers. Thomas took aim. The doubt once clouding his eyes was now replaced by a steely certainty. When the last finger dropped, Thomas squeezed the trigger. The shot split the air like a dry thunderclap, and 1 soldier fell dead without a sound. Chaos erupted. Shouts rang out along the road as the insurgents burst from the shadows, firing with fierce precision. Thomas reloaded with steady hands, ignoring the hiss of bullets passing close. He felt strangely distant. Not a man killing to survive, but one fulfilling a sacred duty. Each shot was a prayer wrenched from the iron heart of freedom. The British, caught off guard, tried to regroup, but the fury of the farmers was unrelenting. Within minutes, silence reclaimed the road, broken only by the groans of the wounded. Thomas walked to the center of the road, stepping over fallen bodies. He felt a mingled grief and grim justice. "This is for her," he murmured, looking up at the clouded sky. And he knew this was only the first bloodshed. Elias approached, his face blackened with powder, and clapped a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "You're one of us now," he said. Thomas did not answer. In his eyes, the reflection of an inner fire burned brighter than ever. This bloodied road would be the first of many. And as the echoes of gunfire still drifted over the hills, Thomas swore Martha's memory would never be forgotten, nor avenged by half. The days that followed brought new victories. Small patrols defeated, supply depots raided. Thomas and the insurgents gained a growing fame in the hills of Millfield. But with fame came poison. In the shadows of the makeshift camp, envious eyes and venomous tongues began to whisper. Not every man armed under the same cause bore a pure heart. Some carried the weight of greed and betrayal. On a moonlit night, Thomas sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle. Elias approached, casting discreet glances around the camp. "There are men here who fight for profit, not for freedom," he said in a low voice. Thomas looked up, alert. "Keep your eyes open, Thomas. Their loyalty lasts only until the first British gold is offered." Thomas clenched his fists, feeling the grim truth. The war was waged within men's souls as well. Across the camp, two men, Reuben and Miles, whispered by the mule pens. Thomas watched them out of instinct. Later he heard from Caleb, now running messages between insurgents, that Reuben had been seen lurking near the abandoned house where they stored supplies. "They're looking to sell our position," Elias said bitterly. "Or worse, sell us alive." Thomas understood then. It was not enough to fight the redcoats. They had to guard against betrayal within their own ranks. In the cold pre-dawn hours, Thomas gathered his trusted men. He spoke plainly, without hesitation. "Freedom will not be built on lies," he said, his voice firm as stone. "Those who betray brothers in arms betray the very soil we fight for." One by one, the hardened faces around the fire nodded. This was not merely survival, it was honor. And that night, they decided. The wolves would be hunted before they could strike. At first light, Reuben and Miles were confronted. Their denials sounded hollow in the biting wind. Thomas stared at them without flinching, remembering Martha, remembering his children. "There is no justice without truth," he said, and ordered them cast out. No weapons, no supplies, left to fend for themselves in the hostile wilderness. The decision weighed heavily, but it was necessary. In times of war, mercy was a rare luxury. Watching the figures disappear into the forest, Thomas felt the burden of leadership bend his shoulders. Every choice demanded a piece of his soul. But when he turned and saw his men standing firm, unwavering, he knew he had chosen rightly. The true battle still lay ahead, and when it came, there could be no room for doubt. At the next dawn, they would march to face the real enemy. The cold cut the skin like blades as Thomas and his men crossed the mist-covered hills. Every step carried weight and purpose. Informants had confirmed. The platoon that sacked Millfield, the same that had destroyed his life, was camped just a few miles ahead. Thomas marched at the front, his eyes locked on the horizon. This was not merely an ambush. It was the final reckoning with the ghosts of the past. Reaching the edge of the enemy camp, the group silently split apart, each man taking his place. Thomas knelt behind a thicket, watching. He spotted the silver-haired British officer who had led the invasion of his home. His stomach churned, but his hand did not tremble. "For those we lost," whispered Elias beside him. "For those we still have to protect," Thomas replied, loading powder into his rifle. The first shot was his. The officer dropped without ever knowing from where death had come. The camp erupted into screams and chaos. Thomas surged forward with the fury of a storm held back for months. Every soldier he brought down was a piece of the pain buried with Martha. It was justice without a court, redemption without words. His men fought with the strength of those who knew that this moment was not merely a victory. It was a rebirth. In the heat of the battle, Thomas found the second in command, the soldier who had grabbed Martha, who had laughed at his despair. They locked eyes, and the world seemed to fall silent around them. "Do you remember me?" Thomas growled. The man tried to flee, but Thomas brought him down with a blow. There was no mercy. When it was done, Thomas stood there, gasping for breath, staring at the hands that now bore the weight of a fulfilled promise. The fighting ceased as swiftly as it had begun. A heavy silence fell over the field, stained with blood and powder. The insurgents, battered and worn, turned their faces toward Thomas, awaiting his word. He looked at them, men who had become brothers, forged in the fire of resistance. "Today we settled an old debt," Thomas said, his voice low and firm. "But the fight for freedom has only just begun." As they gathered weapons and buried their dead, a figure on horseback appeared on the horizon, carrying unknown banners and urgent news. "The war is not over," the messenger cried. "A revolution is underway, and we need men like you." Thomas pressed his fist over his chest. This was no longer just vengeance. It was the birth of a nation. The fields once stained with blood now bloomed with makeshift flags. On every hill, a torch burned brightly against the darkness of tyranny. Thomas rode alongside his companions, rifle slung across his back, eyes fixed on the distant horizon. The call had gone out. Militias from every corner were gathering to form the first great army of American freedom. In the makeshift camp, generals and leaders argued plans under the dim light of lanterns. When Thomas approached, the men parted to let him through. His story had already spread among them, the farmer who lost everything and still rose to defy the crown. "We need men like you, Whitaker," said one of the commanders, grasping his hand firmly. Thomas simply nodded. He did not fight for glory. He fought for the future. For days, Thomas and his insurgents trained alongside men of every background, farmers, blacksmiths, hunters, freed slaves, united not by birth, but by purpose. Every drill, every formation, was a brick laid in the building of something greater than any personal vengeance. "Freedom," Thomas told Caleb, who now bore a rifle of his own. "That's why we're here." On the eve of the decisive battle, Thomas stood alone under the stars. From his pocket, he drew a lock of Martha's hair, tied with a blue ribbon. "See, my love," he whispered. "I'm still fighting for us." The wind answered in a sudden gust. He closed his eyes and imagined her laughter, the children's footsteps, the scent of rain on tilled earth. None of it would be in vain. The world rising from these ashes would be worthy of her memory. When the dawn painted the sky in hues of orange and gold, Thomas led his men onto the battlefield. Ahead, the British ranks gleamed like a wound upon the land. But beside Thomas stood faces set with iron resolve, hearts unbroken. And when the first shot rang out, it was not merely gunpowder that tore through the air. It was the voice of an entire nation shouting, "We will not be enslaved." Victory did not come easily, nor without cost, but it came. And when the dust finally settled, Thomas Whitaker, the farmer who had lost everything, was lifted onto the shoulders of his brothers as a living symbol of resistance. The boy who had wept in Millfield, the husband who had knelt beneath the fig tree, the father whose eyes had burned across the battlefield. They would all live forever in history, because on that day a country was born, and with it, the legacy of the unbroken.